Hey everybody, Jackal's Painting here with a new tutorial, and today we're getting into some Star Wars. I've got the Star Wars Legion Boba Fett miniature, the OG Mandalorian Bounty Hunter, and we're gonna paint this guy up. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while. It's a really nice little miniature, almost no cleanup required. It went together great. I've got him primed up right here, and I left his backpack as a sub-assembly just so that it would be easier to get to parts of the model and do some effects down the road. And the first thing we're going to do is a pre-shade, and a pre-shade is simply layering different colors over your primer to create value for your colors down the line. So typically what you'll see is grays, light grays, and maybe even some pure white over top of your primer, so that when you paint on your very thin coats of paint that you actually want, so like in the case of our model here, it'll be some greens and browns and ivories, things of that nature. We have some values preloaded onto the model from dark to light, and it helps speed things up where you don't have to put as much paint on the model to achieve certain effects. We're just doing that with the airbrush here, going from black to a mid-tone gray to a light neutral gray, and then at the very end we're just doing a little teeny tiny bit of pure white just to pop some things out right at the end. And if you're doing this at home, whenever you're working with very lightly pigmented paints, such as this pure white or some really bright yellows, make sure to use plenty of flow improver. So just increase the ratio of flow improver that you normally use, because white is notorious for speckling onto the model, and we want our pre-shades to be nice and smooth. And sometimes when you do a pre-shade, you might actually utilize it and let it do most of the work for your colors, and sometimes it's just like a blueprint, a guideline, so that you know kind of where certain things need to be highlighted. And in some cases on this model I will be doing that, and in other cases I'll be using it as a blueprint so I know where to paint stuff. And the first color we're going to be using is some ivory from Pro Acryl. All the colors that I'm using in this tutorial are going to be Pro Acryl colors from the sets that they sell. And I was looking at some different miniatures and toys and the screen accurate costume that Boba Fett was wearing, and I noticed that in a lot of those pictures he's got this sort of like tunic over top of what looks like a gray jumpsuit, and then his armor is on top of that, and he's got these two very large pouches kind of hanging from his belt, and this little sort of like tunic vest underneath his chest armor that are more of a cream color, whilst the rest of his little jumpsuit gear is a very light gray. So the first thing we're doing is that ivory, painting it on very thin so that it can dry very fast between coats, and we don't put too much of that ivory, because when you're trying to cover with a paint like ivory or any very lightly pigmented bright paint, you want to work in very thin layers so you don't cake it up on there. After that, I'm going to grab some light neutral gray. I actually use this in our pre-shade, but it's going to be more concentrated and more vibrant by hand painting it. Again, I'm still working with very thin coats, and I'm layering it on top of our pre-shade in areas where I want that gray fabric to pop more. So on details and on the folds and wrinkles in the cloth and things like that, I am layering up this light neutral gray to kind of pop that out more, and then using the darker shades of gray in the recesses from our pre-shade to kind of be our built-in shadows for our gray cloth. once again, when you're working with paint that is this lightly pigmented, you want to work in very thin coats. And I'm actually trying to have most of the areas that I'm painting be almost transparent when I'm painting them on. So this paint is exceptionally thin when I'm painting it on there. I know it looks very vibrant because the light neutral gray is kind of what I would classify as like an off-white gray. It's very, very bright. So when I actually put it onto the model and it's still fresh, it does reflect light, almost like a white paint, but then it will mute down as it dries. And the thinner your paint is, as it dries and mutes out, it will actually show more of what's underneath it. So I'm just focusing on these details and big flat areas where light is going to be directly hitting the model, or if like he was a real person, where light would be hitting those pieces of cloth the brightest, and just very lightly and thinly layering up this light neutral gray so that you can see those details and utilize the values from our pre-shade as best as I can. All right, next we're going to do his boots, and he's got these very, very dark gray, almost black little combat boots that he wears. And instead of just painting it flat black and then having to highlight on top of that, what I did is grab some of this transparent black from Pro Acryl and thin it out ever so slightly. It's almost like an ink. It's very dense in its pigmentation, so a little bit of water, a little bit of flow improver to get it to be not so much a wash. You want it to be more dense than a wash, but just thin enough to where I can lightly paint it over these boots and let the pre-shade do all of our highlight work for us, so I don't have to do any work down the road. It's just pre-done. After that, we're going to mix some camo green and dark umber about 50-50, just to darken it down a little bit, because when you're hand painting with very thin paint over a bright pre-shade like this, those values of light gray and white are going to brighten up whatever color you put on top of it. And I want to be able to have some shadows and some highlights on these green armor plates, so I'm going to darken the paint down first for our base coat. Next, I'm going to work on his cape, and in the pictures of his costume from the movies, it is an olive drab color, just like his green armor, but it's more on the brown side, and it's a little bit dingier. And if I were to guess, the fabric looks like maybe some old army blankets, maybe it's like some army surplus blankets of wool that are kind of dingier olive drab. So all I did was mix in more of that dark umber brown, and then thin it out a little bit more, so that after we paint a couple of very thin coats over our pre-shade on the cape, it gets us that color. So it is going to be that olive drab color, but it's going to be more brown and more dingy. And then what I'm going to do is use that exact same color and very carefully glaze that color onto the lower edges of our armor plates to create a shadow. And for the highlights, I'm taking the baseline camo green and then mixing in a little bit of a light gray to it and glazing that on the higher edges of our armor plates. And that's going to give us a bright, medium, dark gradient on all of our armor plates. So that way they look nice and dynamic, but without being comic booky and over the top. I want to get that gradient built into his armor for some dynamic colors, but I don't want to go over the top, because we are going to try to stick to the more muted tones of his actual costume from the movies. Last step on that armor is going to be a little bit more of that light gray. I'm still using the same light neutral gray that we had out before, just ever so much more into that mixture to do our final little glaze highlight on the top edges of his plate armor and to create some little shine spots on the dome of his helmet. Next, I'm going to grab that same dark umber, we're going to be using that a lot, and some burnt red, and we're going to knock in the kind of baseline maroon color for the red pieces of his armor. And again, instead of going with straight burnt red onto the model, I want some of that dark umber mixed in to darken it down ever so slightly, because I know that if I put the burnt red right on top of our pre-shade in the thin paint coats that we want for this model, it'll kind of brighten it up too much and it'll actually go into more of like a pink color. So I want to darken it down a little bit before we brighten it back up. And I'm just going to very carefully paint over those details. I'm trying to make sure that I don't get any slop anywhere, because I've already worked up our green armor and I don't want to get any red on our pieces of gray uniform. And we're just taking our time. Like, this is a very slow paint process compared to how I normally paint game pieces like our Space Marines and stuff for 40k, where it's very poppy, very dynamic, and very fast. So I'm taking my time, doing a lot of hand painting, just kind of living in the moment and enjoying the process of layering up these colors on a really nice miniature. After that, I'm going to take some of that same light neutral gray and start mixing that into our red mix of burnt red and dark umber. And I also added in just a couple of drops of bold pyrrole red, which is the very bright, vibrant fire engine red color in this paint set, just to make sure that it didn't kind of pink out the red too much. Because if it was just a very bright color like white or ivory or our light neutral gray, it will start shifting over into the pink spectrum, and that's not what we want. So that little bit of very bright, vibrant red will make sure that we keep a brighter, more vibrant red color without going into the pink range for our highlights. After our reds are done, we're going to focus on his secondary little armor plates, like his shoulder pads and knee pads, that are a yellow ochre color. And I've grabbed yellow ochre from Pro Acryl and thinned it out, and I'm just doing some very light thin coats over those plates. And as I was actually painting this, I was noticing that this yellow ochre, maybe like I thinned it out a little bit too much. It just wasn't it wasn't building up the color that I was wanting to in the way that I was wanting to do it. So there is a little bit of a back and forth on this one miniature. So what I suggest is, instead of starting off with the yellow ochre, actually start with the next color, which is the yellow ochre with a little bit of brown mixed in, just to darken it down a little bit into a darker yellow ochre color that's a little bit more on the brown side of things. It covers a little bit better, and on this model, I ended up using that as like our shadow color. So after I did a couple of coats of light ochre on this guy, I mixed in a little bit of that brown and I started layering in our shadows. And I actually just ended up going over the entire piece because the yellow was drying and it was way too transparent, and it was just kind of not getting the color I wanted. So I almost did a little bit of a reset when I started to layer in our shadows. Yeah, yellow is a really tricky color. I think, anybody who paints miniatures definitely knows that yellow is kind of a tricky color to paint with. So you're seeing everything I was doing at the time I was doing it, and in hindsight, and kind of during the painting process, like I was saying, like I decided to kind of reset and start off with the darker yellow ochre color and then highlight up on top of that. So that's why I recommend like just go a little bit darker with yellows and ochre colors like this, because even with a pre-shade, it can be a little tricky to work with, and going a little bit darker than maybe what you wanted originally might be an easier process in the long run. Now for our highlights, I just took that same color that we had and I started mixing in a couple of drops of a brighter yellow, just straight up golden yellow, and a little bit of that light neutral gray. And I'm using the light neutral gray in a lot of these mixes instead of a white or an ivory, because ivory will brighten the colors into that more pastel highlight color, but it'll be on the warmer side, and we don't want that. We want our colors to stay kind of on the cooler side temperature wise to fit with the more sort of worn out, lived in universe that Star Wars is very known for. So instead of going for the warm pastel color with ivory, I'm sticking with the light neutral gray because it'll brighten up my colors, but it won't warm them up too much. It'll stay nice and kind of faded as it gets highlighted up to fit that lived in universe. For his belt and a couple of other pieces, I'm using just dark umber. I've thinned it out quite a bit so that I can paint in very thin coats over our pre-shade. Yet again, that's kind of the repeating pattern on a model like this, where you have to do a lot of hand painting over a pre-shade. You want your paints to be really thin, and I would actually go thinner than maybe what you anticipate, because you can always add more paint, but having to fix putting on too much paint is a real hassle. So when in doubt, thin it out a little bit more. And when I'm working with paint that's this thin and watery, I guess is a good way to describe it, before I actually go onto the model, I'll load up my paintbrush and then gently touch it to a paper towel over by my palette, which will suck out all the excess moisture from the brush, and then I can paint in very thin coats without overloading how much liquid I'm putting on the model, so that way I don't have runny or drippy paint layers. After that, I'm going from dark umber to light umber, and I'm also using the very, very thinned out light umber to go over this little braid that he's got on one shoulder. In most of the pictures that I had pulled up, it was really hard to see it, because in reality the braid is a lot skinnier and thinner than on the model, which is kind of in a heroic scale. So it was really hard to gauge exactly what color it was, so I kind of just, called an audible, and I was like, I'm gonna make it like a tan color, and that'll go with the rest of the palette. And since I need to highlight our belt anyways, I'll just use that thinned out highlight color over the pre-shade to get a really nice light tan. Now that all of those colors are in there, I'm going to grab just regular old coal black, just a flat matte black, and I'm going to cut in everything that I want to be black. Sometimes with models, you need to do a little bit of black lining around certain details if they're very shallow. I didn't really have to do that on this model, but I did want to cut in the iconic, black void of a faceplate that the Mandalorians are known for. It's like totally non-reflective, very menacing. And on his belt, I ended up needing to blackline some of the details between the pouches, because the detail was so shallow, I just knew that the wash wasn't going to cut in hard enough detail. And then I go around the model and start kind of blotching and dotting and creating little scratchy marks on his armor. Some of the model has some sculpted like dents and cracks and scratches in his armor, and so I'm just shading those with the black paint, making it very dark, and also going around the edges of some of his armor and creating little dots and dashes and little splotches. And I'm not going crazy, I'm trying to do it as minimally as possible so that I don't do too much, because Boba Fett is known for having that very, very paint chipped armor, and we are going to show that metal coming through, and this black paint is our shadow. It's making the paint look 3D. When this guy is on the table and and you're 3 or 4 feet away, you can see that his armor is paint chipped by this dark black paint being our sort of like fake shadow. But you don't want to go overboard, and that's why I'm being very meticulous and very careful. And while that's drying, I'm coming in with some dark silver that I have darkened down with a little bit of the black that we had on our palette. And I'm just painting in his little blaster carbine and his backpack, and I think the little rangefinder thing on his helmet, just as our base gunmetal color. Now we're going to come back with our bright silver, and I'm going to very carefully sort of run the bullseye and dot all of those little black splotches with a very small amount of silver. And we're kind of going along the edges and finding these dents and cuts and cracks and all the places that I've put some black paint, and dotting it very carefully with some silver paint, and it's going to pop it out, and it's going to look like those really iconic paint chips that he has all over his armor, and you'll be able to see it across the table. So this is probably the most least realistic step on the entire model, just because these are a little bit bigger than they would be within scale if you were actually painting every single little detail to scale. But on the table, it'll look really nice, and it gets that point across, and people will immediately see it, and in their heads it'll click that, oh, it's like these like paint chips, because it's the shiny metal and the dark shadow of the black paint. It looks great. And the reason I painted our gun before doing the step is so that I could also do some of this bright silver on our metallic pieces, because again, everything in Star Wars is very weathered, and that's kind of the iconic look. And so I'm very delicately and gently going over a lot of the hard edge details on our gun and the backpack, and rubbing that silver paint on there so it looks like you have that black anodized gun finish that's been worn off due to years and years of use. And next we're going to get into our wash, and I have been using this Mr. Hobby weathering color system for a while now, and I discovered that if you actually pour a little bit of the thinner into a receptacle, I'm just using an old jug lid here, and then mix in the oil wash into that and kind of pre-dilute it, it goes over the model much easier with much less cleanup, so we get this ultra clean hard edge color wash without a ton of cleanup. And it's just been like a quantum leap in being able to use this stuff effectively on models. And again, sticking with the Star Wars Worn in Universe stuff, I'm mixing in the Stain Brown with a little small amount of our multi-black to get a more dingier color going across his model. And I do have to do a little bit of cleanup, just because when you put a lot of wash on a model, it will run over the model and it will pool up, so you need to wick that away. And if I notice that it's gathering up or staining too much in any one place, I am wicking that away and kind of blending it back with that solvent and my little oil wash brush here that I've been using in a lot of my more recent videos, just to make sure we don't have any nasty coffee stains anywhere and everything is nice and clean and all of our details are popping out. Alright, next we're going to rapid fire paint some flame effects on his backpack. It actually comes with these two little flame effects you can glue on there. And starting off with bold titanium white, I'm just going to lightly airbrush over these effects and actually get a little bit up onto the thruster bells. And I see people make the mistake with fire a lot of times where like the brightest point of the fire, like the white hot fire, is on the tips of the flames. And that's not how fire works. It's brightest and hottest at the source of ignition. So that's going to be right at the base of those thruster bells where the fire is actually coming out. So I'm starting with white up next to the thrusters. And then as we go out from those thrusters, we're going to be building up our warm flame colors. So that's why I started with white. And next, I'm going to go about halfway down and start layering on some transparent yellow that I have mixed up in the airbrush. It's just golden yellow with some flow improver. Pretty easy. And very lightly airbrush from kind of the halfway point down to the tip of those flame effects. And if you get a little bit extra, like if you kind of creep it up onto the thruster bells, that's not that big a deal because we do want some transparent paint kind of blending together over top of these effects to give us a nice warm fire effect. After that, same thing, just mixing some orange in there, plenty of flow improvers so it's nice and thin, and I'm going to focus that out towards the tip of the flame effects. And once I have that cut in, I'm going to back the airbrush out away from the backpack and very lightly do some thin spraying and kind of creep that orange up as a transparent coat all the way to those thruster bells, so I don't have any just like straight up white paint on the thrusters. It looks more like an OSL glow effect. Alright, so I've got the backpack mounted up onto the model now, and we're going to do a little bit of OSL from those thruster effects. I have the exact same paint I was using, I just set the airbrush aside, slapped the backpack on there, and now we're going to do our OSL. And when you're doing OSL, you want to make sure that you're working in very transparent layers of paint, and I'm just layering those onto the hem of his cape and his leg there to create that nice, warm, fiery glow effect from his thrusters firing off. When you're doing OSL, you want to make sure that the paint is very transparent, because if you paint just like solid matte paint onto the area that you want light to reflect off of, then that surface is going to look like your ignition source, or the source where the light is actually coming from, rather than where it's bouncing off of. So that's why you want to be very, very careful, very transparent with those OSL paints. Next, we're going to work on his base. I've got a nice sort of cyber city punk resin base from Elric's Hobbies here. First step is just going to be to slap some dark silver onto there in a nice solid base coat. After that, I'm going to grab some sky blue, and I'm going to paint whatever this little crossbar thingy is. I don't know, like a little cross plate, little connecting plate, whatever this is. And I'm just going to paint it super bright sky blue, nice solid coat, just to get that sort of neon city Star Wars color look, almost like this guy is maybe hunting a bounty on Coruscant or something like that. After that's dry, I'm grabbing some coal black and very gently kind of stippling on that black paint around the edges of this little metal piece to, again, create some shadows for some paint chipping. And I want this to be really scuffed up, really well worn, and so that's why I'm stippling it to create all those little teeny tiny scratches. After that, I'm grabbing some dark silver, because it's still right on the palette from when we painted the base, and I'm going to start creating those paint chips. And I'm also going to grab some regular silver, which is much shinier, and layer that on as well to create some nice vibrant metallics on our paint chips. And for these two little plates here, I've got some bronze from Pro Acryl. It's a pretty dark paint, and I want to get kind of a unique look to these plates, what I'm just going to call space metal. right? So that's just kind of the idea I had in my head when I was painting these. I don't want it to just be flat bronze. I kind of want like a weird bronzy, golden, silvery space metal. I don't know. So on my palette, I'm just mixing in silver into the bronze, and I'm just kind of putting that around different areas where I want to kind of transition those colors from darker bronze to a more brighter, mixed in silvery bronze color. And then going dark to light, just kind of putting a little bit of dark paint on, swirling that around, kind of wet blending it as I go, to bringing back some of the brighter paint to kind of get a nice, even, smooth transition in those two metallics to get that space metal look. And when I was done, I said, yep, that looks like some weird space metal, good enough for me. Once that's all dry, I'm coming back with our Mr. Hobby Weathering colors, and we're going to dinge up this city base with some stained brown and some black to cut in those colors, dinge up those metallics, and dirty up our paint on that little cross beam. And so I'm just layering that on there, kind of wicking it away, blending it to just dinge out those colors, dirty everything up, and then let it dry. While I was blending this, I just kept going back and forth because when I'm trying to heavily weather surfaces like this, the process is a little back and forth. You put some on, you take some off, rinse, repeat. I was using my brush and some Q-tips to kind of streak it and wick away any excess because I don't want that blue to just be like clean, pristine blue. I want it to be dirty. And I've got it mounted up to the base now. I'm using this Lucky varnish from Ammo by MIG. And I really like this ultra matte varnish. It's like airbrush ready, just drop it in there, start spraying, dries really fast, and so far I've been really liking it over the Vallejo varnish that I've been using in the past. And here he is. He's totally done. I really like how it came out. We've got some very nice colors on the model that are very screen accurate, or at least as close as I could reasonably get, you know, with just some pictures on the internet as reference. I also mounted him using a little pen that I painted black, and the reason I did that is because his flight stand is really, really short, so it looks like he's just kind of doing like a little little jump off the ground rather than boosting off ready to, you know, shoot his quarry. And it also gives him more of an angle, like he's boosting up in an arc. Hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll catch you next time.